Hey guys, this is Ryan Fee for UpswingPoker.com, making some exclusive content for Card Player. And what we're going to chat about today is check raising. Sort of the theory behind it, when to do it, and we're going to focus specifically on the flop. So in this first instance, the board we're going to be dealing with is King 5-2 Rainbow, so really dry board. And the positions are going to be the the hijack raises first in, and the big blind calls. So in this situation, I've given, this is the hijack raise first in range. This is one of the upswing ranges. And what we've done here is we've ranked all the hands on the flop. So hands that are red are, we were looking at the wrong range. Here we go. Now we have ranked all the hands properly on the flop. So the hands in red, sort of king, queen plus, are value bets. The hands in pink are basically queen high and worse, are bluffs. And then the hands in greens are hands are going to check back the flop with. So on this king 5-2 rainbow board versus this hijack c-bet strategy, and what we're doing here is we're assuming we're in the big blind, we're just going to check 100% of our range, which is the correct play and the standard play. If we then face a what's called a polarized c-bet range, meaning your opponent has either really good hands or complete bluffs, there's very little incentive to check raise. The reason being is that if your opponent has bet one of these value bets on the flop, especially on what's called a static or a dry board, meaning that there are very few turns that will change the strength of players' hands in any sort of meaningful way, then, or rather the ranges, then there's less incentive to check raise, or rather there's, if your opponent bet kings, king, queen, ace, king on the flop, there's a good chance they're just going to keep betting it on the turn. There's no reason for them to stop betting. They have these really strong hands, and they want to get value from worse pairs, maybe some draws, and all the worst kings you could have. Then that's on the value side of the coin. On the bluff side of the coin, if they have a hand like, Jack 10 or 7-6 could maybe turn a straight draw, hands that pick up equity, or hands that, can't really show down and maybe can block you having top pair, those hands are good hands to pick as, hands that might continue bluffing. So there's very little reason to check raise this board, because by check raising this board, kind of essentially what you're doing is representing a hand like a set, or maybe king 5 suited, and then trying to get more value with those really strong hands versus hands like ace king and pocket aces, all the really top hands in the flop c-bet range. So, excuse me. So since those hands are going to bet the turn and probably the river anyway, and you might also get your opponent to bluff, it's better to not check raise this flop. What you should be doing is check raising what's called the inflection street. The inflection street is the street at which your opponent is likely, the street after the inflection street is the street where your opponent is much less likely to bet. So given this really sort of polarized range on the flop, and bet especially with their value bets, given this really polarized range on the flop, it's very unlikely that your opponent is going to shut down on the turn or river with any of the value bets. So by just calling with a hand like pocket fives, essentially what you're doing is maxing out on value for all the times your opponent still has bluffs in the range and decides to keep bluffing, and you're still getting the value from those value bets anyway. In this particular instance, we picked a really extreme example where the inflection street is actually the river. Your opponent can't really bet past the river, so the inflection street is the river. So, if the board runs off king 5-2 9-3, and you have your pocket fives and you've called flop, you've called the turn, you're going to use them to turn them into a bluff on the river and then go for the check raise there. So that's on sort of one side of the spectrum, really dry static board versus a polarized range, where you're basically never going to want to check raise the flop. You're always going to want to check call, and then go for a raise on what in this instance is probably going to be the inflection rate of the river, because your opponent will not stop betting until he gets there. Even if he has king queen, he's probably going to feel pretty good about his spot should he bet all the way down. So in situation number 2, we have a very dynamic board, 8-6, 8-6-4 with a flush draw. So, excuse me. What's different about this board, and we'll go over the range real quick. So basically, the value at range sort of like ace-8 plus, sets, 2-pair and straights, over pairs, and then some straight draws, and then all these like sort of overcard combos that are used as bluffs. And there's a couple things that are interesting about this board. The thing that's most interesting is that it's a dynamic board, meaning that several turns will change the dynamic of the board, the dynamic of the hand, and will make it such that your opponent will be much less likely to want to value bet. So on this board, a 4 through a 10, so any 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10, sort of in varying ways change all the hand strengths on this board, as does any heart. So, that's like almost half the deck. It's actually probably more than half the deck, and that. So, like for instance, let's say the turn's the 7 of hearts. Your opponent's going to be far less likely to want to value bet a hand like pocket tens, maybe even 2-pair or ace-8. So your opponent's likely to check back with a ton of those hands and make it such that you're missing value on a card like the 7 of hearts. I mean, really any 7 or 5. A 4 to definitely a lesser extent because you're going to be calling them way less often. A 6 to a sort of mediumer extent. You'll have a few more 6s in your pre-flop range. And then an 8 to a large extent. You'll have so many 8s that given their pre-flop bet sizing, you might even have some offsuit 8s. So, an 8 will also change the dynamic of the board. Excuse me. As will a 9 and 10, giving some 2 pairs are getting there, straights are getting there. It's harder to want to fire with some bluffs, because even some of your weaker hands have now, if you have a 7, you have the 5 and the 9 make a straight. So if the big blind is a 7. So this is a board that's going to face less turn bets. So the inflection street here is the flop, because even if your opponent bets all these really strong hands in the flop, there's just a number of turns that are going to shut your opponent down from betting, and such you would be missing out on value from some really strong hands like maybe top 2 pair, a straight, or a set. So check raising those hands and then working in some bluffs as well is a great strategy on this board, because you end up maxing out on value, and sort of making it really tough for your opponent to have what to do with their overpairs, because they have a lot more sort of thinner value bets in this situation, and their high card hand, their bluff hands, have a lot more equity. If you think about the king 5-2, when your opponent had queen jack, if you had top pair, your opponent would really have basically no outs. They would need backdoor outs. Whereas if you have even top pair, top kicker on this board, and your opponent has queen jack, he's going to have he's going to have 2 overcards as well as the backdoor straight draw. In this case, maybe a backdoor flush draw. So there's a lot of things, equity is sort of running closer on this board. So being able to have a raising range and making your opponent fold a lot of hands that are in the middle and then towards the bottom that have a lot more equity ends up being very beneficial for you and your range. If you don't end up raising this spot, you're essentially just kind of giving your opponents kind of like a walk in a very theoretical sense. You're just, your range just isn't playing efficiently enough. And you're sort of giving them a free pass to just bet the flop in a close equity spot and have no real repercussions. There's no incentive for them not to bet this flop. In the range that we have here, it's a little bit, it's a fairly balanced range. Some players will bet a few too many 8s, maybe even ace high, just like a few too many really marginal bluffs and value bets on the flop. Versus them, it's even more appealing to check raise the flop. So, sort of in closing, on the one hand, if the board is static and your opponent is likely to keep betting whether they have a bluff or a value bet, you want to just call the flop or the turn, whatever street it may be. and wait to raise the river. Whereas if the board's more dynamic, there's more maybe thin value bets, like equities run closer, and the turn or river could oftentimes change the texture of the board, and you want to shut down your opponent's abilities to do a bet and then check strategy, check raising the flop with your really strong hands and then some bluffs as well, puts your opponent in a tough spot and then makes them reconsider what hands they are betting on the flop to begin with.